The year is 1888. A thick, yellow fog clings to the cobblestones of Whitechapel, swallowing the streetlights and muffling the distant sounds of the city. It is a heavy, sulphurous shroud that refuses to lift. Inspector Abberline stands beneath a flickering gas lamp, the glass humming with a dying light. He stares at a chalk mark, etched into the damp brick wall. It is the 5th time he has stood in a place like this month. The air is cold, tasting of coal smoke and wet iron. He turns his gaze toward the shadows pooling at the base of the tenements. The body lies there, perfectly still, untouched by the chaos of the city that pulses just a few streets away. The silence here is absolute, a heavy weight that presses against his chest. He does not move, his boots planted firmly on the slick, uneven stone. The city is a labyrinth of secrets, and tonight, the fog has delivered another. He watches the mist swirl around the victim, waiting for a sign, a footprint, or a sound. But there is nothing. Only the low, rhythmic hiss of the gas lamp and the encroaching dark. The reality of the situation settles into his bones. Abberline reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded scrap. The paper was stiff, damp from the pervasive mist, and felt heavy in his hand. He smoothed it against his palm, his thumb tracing the jagged, uneven lines of the ink. It was written in a deep, dried red. He held it up to the dying light of the gas lamp, squinting to make out the words, "Dear Boss." The taunt stared back at him, mocking the silence. He read the lines again, his eyes scanning the sharp, aggressive strokes of the pen. The words were a direct challenge, a claim of ownership. A tremor started in his fingers, but he forced his hand to remain still. He read the taunt a 3rd time, the gravity of the threat sinking into his mind. The ink seemed to pulse under the flickering yellow light. His grip tightened, knuckles turning white against the dim backdrop of the wall. The paper groaned, the fibers straining under the pressure of his thumb and forefinger. With a sharp, sudden sound, the edge of the letter gave way. A tear ripped through the center of the page, jagged and final. He stared at the ruined evidence, his jaw set, the weight of the hunt shifting. The news did not travel by word of mouth alone. It moved through the marrow of the city. By midnight, the streets of Whitechapel were devoid of life. A shopkeeper on the corner of the main thoroughfare heard the rumors and acted instantly. He slammed his heavy oak door shut, his hands shaking as he slid the iron bolt into place. The metal shrieked against the frame, a sound that echoed down the empty street. One by one, the neighbors followed suit. The rhythmic clatter of bolts sliding home became the heartbeat of the district. Every window was shuttered, every latch secured with desperate force. People retreated into their rooms, pressing their backs against solid wood, listening to the silence outside. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and suffocating, as if it were trying to find a way in. No one looked out. No one dared to light a candle that might be seen from the alleyway. The paranoia was a physical weight, turning every creak of the floorboards into a potential intrusion. The predator was out there, somewhere in the mist, and the city had turned itself into a fortress of wood and iron. The streets were no longer public space. They were a hunting ground. Mary moved through the narrow alley, her steps muffled by the damp, uneven stones. The fog hung low, swirling around her ankles like cold water. She kept her right hand deep in her pocket, fingers curled tightly around the cold metal of a whistle. Every few paces, she paused, tilting her head to listen. There was nothing but the distant, rhythmic drip of condensation. She started walking again, faster now, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then, it happened. A heavy, deliberate boot scraped against the wet stone behind her. She stopped instantly, her breath hitching in her throat. The sound ceased. She waited, eyes wide, staring into the impenetrable gray. Silence returned, absolute and heavy. She took a tentative step forward. The scrape echoed again, a single, sharp sound of leather on grit. She halted. The sound stopped. It was not a coincidence. She stood perfectly still, the damp air clinging to her skin, listening to the void. The rhythm of the alley had changed. She felt the weight of a gaze pressing against her back. She gripped the whistle until her knuckles ached, waiting for the next sound to break the stillness. Mary spun around, her body coiled to scream. She thrust her hand out, ready to blow the whistle, but the air met no resistance. The alley was empty. A row of jagged brick walls stretched into the gloom, untouched by any living soul. She took a frantic step toward the shadows where the sound had originated, but found only a discarded crate and a puddle of stagnant water. The silence was no longer heavy, it was absolute. She searched the ground for footprints, but the wet stone held no marks. Her pulse thundered in her ears, a frantic rhythm that felt entirely out of place in the stillness. She looked up, scanning the rooftops, then back at the dark mouth of the alley. Nothing moved. The realization settled into her bones. Like a chill, the pursuer had vanished. She remained rooted to the spot, her fingers still locked around the whistle, but the instrument felt useless now. She stood in the center of the passage, shivering as the fog swirled around her, paralyzed. The alley was a tomb, and she was the only thing breathing inside it. By dawn, the tenements were swarming with men in heavy boots. They kicked open doors, splintering wood, and dragged residents into the hallways for questioning. The air in the cramped corridors grew thick with the smell of sweat and desperation. Detectives moved from room to room, their notebooks filling with conflicting accounts, yet every lead hit a wall of silence. They checked the hands of laborers, the tools of butchers, and the alibis of the wealthy, but the trail went cold at every turn. A lead would emerge, a sighting, a rumor, a scrap of evidence, only to dissolve into the yellow fog the moment they reached for it. There were no fingerprints on the doorframes, no discarded items in the gutters, no witnesses who could describe a face. The detectives worked until their eyes burned, searching for a single physical trace, but the killer left only emptiness. By the time the sun tried to pierce the smog, the investigators stood in the streets, empty-handed and defeated. Deep beneath the streets, the basement of Scotland Yard became a tomb for paper. Files stacked in precarious towers, reaching toward the damp ceiling. Every desk was buried under reports, sketches, and conflicting testimonies that refused to align. One folder suggested a surgeon with surgical precision, while the next whispered of a royal conspiracy involving the highest tiers of society. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust and ink. Detectives paced the narrow aisles, arguing over the significance of a single chalk mark. Tension vibrated through the room, snapping like a taut wire. The police chief stood at the center of the chaos, his face flushed with a dark, boiling frustration. He grabbed a handful of reports and slammed his fist onto the wooden desk, sending inkwells rattling and papers scattering across the floor. The sound echoed off the stone walls, sharp and desperate. He stared at the mess, his chest heaving, searching for a pattern that did not exist. The law was drowning in its own paperwork, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the phantom they were trying to cage. The shouting in the basement ceased, replaced by a silence more heavy than the dust. The chief swept the scattered files into a pile, his movements slow and mechanical. He walked to the small, barred window and watched the fog press against the glass. The hunt was over. No more teams were dispatched to the alleys. The official records were closed, marked with a final, hollow stamp. Above ground, the city did not return to normal. The iron bolts remained locked long after the sun went down. Residents walked the center of the streets, avoiding the shadows that clung to the brickwork. People stopped speaking of the crimes, yet they watched the mist with wide, unblinking eyes. Even in the absence of the man, his presence remained, a cold weight pressing down on the cobblestones. The decades rolled forward, grinding the Victorian era into dust. The flickering gas lamps that once cast long, distorted shadows against the brickwork were unscrewed and hauled away. In their place, harsh electric bulbs hummed to life, bathing the streets in a clinical, unwavering light. The uneven, mud-slicked cobblestones were pried up by heavy machinery and buried beneath layers of smooth, modern asphalt. The narrow alleys were widened, the tenements were demolished, and the city skyline climbed higher toward the clouds. London shed its skin, layer by layer, until the Whitechapel of 1888 existed only in memory. Yet, the transformation was merely cosmetic. Beneath the new pavement, and behind the steel frames of modern buildings, the core of the mystery remained frozen. The passage of time did not erode the facts, it only deepened the silence. The city grew, the population shifted, and the rhythms of daily life accelerated. But the phantom of the fog stayed anchored to the ground. Every new development in the city served only to highlight the void left behind. The focus shifted from the streets to the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the archives. Here, the air smelled of dust and decaying cellulose. Historians sat at heavy wooden tables, their hands gloved in white cotton as they turned the brittle pages of century-old ledgers. They moved with deliberate, measured precision, scanning lines of cramped, fading script for a name that had never been spoken in court. Each document was a relic, a fragment of a night that refused to be forgotten. They laid out maps of the old district, overlaying them with modern grids, searching for a discrepancy, a missed connection, or a hidden signature in the margins. A magnifying glass hovered over a jagged, red-inked letter, the lens distorting the loops of the handwriting. The researcher paused, tracing the stroke of a letter with a finger, then sighed and recorded the observation. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and the rhythmic ticking of a clock. They were hunting a ghost through the medium of ink. The search was a slow, meticulous process of sifting through the debris of history, looking for a truth that remained stubbornly out of reach. The investigation moved from the archive table to the laboratory. High-resolution scanners captured every fiber of the surviving letters, converting ink and paper into millions of digital pixels. Software designed to detect subtle variations in pressure and stroke speed ran through the night, attempting to map the killer's hand movements with mathematical precision. The screens flickered with complex data visualizations, overlaying geographical crime patterns with demographic shifts of the 19th century. Every lead was fed into predictive models, yet the output remained a jagged, incoherent mess. A forensic linguist analyzed the syntax of the taunting letters, running the phrasing through databases of thousands of contemporary writers. But the results returned only statistical noise. The technology was flawless, the datasets were vast, and the processing power was immense. Yet the core of the mystery resisted every digital probe. The machines, like the detectives before them, hit a wall of static. The more they magnified the evidence, the more the identity of the man in the fog dissolved. The failure of the digital probes marked a definitive shift. The investigation was no longer about catching a man. It was about confronting a void. Monitors dimmed. A shadow, not a suspect. The name was never meant to be found. It had been erased by time, leaving behind only the cold, impenetrable architecture of the legend. The killer had successfully transitioned from a historical figure into a ghost, a presence that existed outside the reach of evidence or logic. The city's mystery became a fixture. No prints, no eyes, just a name's void. The man in the fog had achieved a strange, terrible immortality. He was no longer a butcher or a surgeon. He was the personification of the unknown. Case outgrew law, time, memory's truth. The legend settled into the very mortar of Whitechapel. It was no longer a matter of records or files, but a weight carried by the streets themselves. When the wind howls through the narrow passages at night, the residents still pause, listening for the rhythmic scrape of a boot that should have vanished over a century ago. The city has absorbed the tragedy, turning every dark corner into a silent witness. Modern construction crews digging beneath the pavement often find themselves working in an atmosphere of heavy, inexplicable stillness, as if the ground remembers the events of 1888. The name is etched into the dark, hidden in the shadows that stretch long against the brickwork. It is a permanent stain on the geography of London. Footsteps echo, unaware of grief. The tragedy has become part of the city's pulse, a heartbeat of uncertainty that thrums beneath the traffic and the noise of the present day. The fog may have cleared, but the presence remains, lingering in the damp air and the narrow alleys, ensuring that the mystery of the phantom is never truly forgotten. The fog of 1888 never truly lifted. It merely thinned, transforming into a permanent haze that obscures the truth from every prying eye. Decades turn into centuries, yet the core of the mystery remains as thick and impenetrable as the original London smog. Every new generation of investigators approaches the archives with fresh resolve, convinced that their perspective will finally cut through the gloom. They arrive with sharpened logic and modern scrutiny, only to find themselves standing in the same suffocating darkness as their predecessors. The questions remain identical, untouched by the passage of time. Why did the trail vanish? How did a man move through such a crowded district without leaving a single trace? These inquiries are passed down like heirlooms, each researcher picking up the burden of the unknown. They pore over the same maps, trace the same alleyways. The fog is not merely a weather condition, it is the boundary of human knowledge regarding the events of that autumn. It resists every attempt at clarity. The more they reach for an answer, the more the truth recedes, leaving behind only the damp, cold certainty that some secrets are designed to remain hidden. The ink on the original letters is losing its battle against time. The red pigment, once vibrant and alarming, now flakes away from the brittle paper, turning into a faint, rust-colored dust. Each time a researcher turns a page, the jagged handwriting seems to retreat further into the fibers of the parchment. Yet, the taunt itself remains razor-sharp. The words, "Dear bosses," still carry the same cold, calculated weight they held in 1888. This creates a jarring dissonance. The physical evidence is dissolving, crumbling into nothingness, while the memory of the threat burns with undiminished intensity. It is a slow, silent erosion of the material past. The paper is yellowed and thin, prone to tearing under the slightest pressure, yet the intent behind the ink refuses to soften. Historians handle these documents with gloved hands, watching as the loops and slashes of the letters slowly surrender to the air. The contrast is visceral. As the ink vanishes, the mystery only gains a sharper, more haunting outline. The phantom remains as vivid and dangerous as the night he first stepped into the Whitechapel fog. The search has become an academic ritual, a relentless scouring of the margins. Historians sit in climate-controlled rooms, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the erratic pen strokes of century-old records. They look for a name, a slip of the tongue, a hidden confession buried in the bureaucratic clutter of the Victorian police force. Every few years, a new theory emerges with the promise of finality. A fresh analysis of the postmarks, a digital mapping of the crime scenes, a linguistic breakdown of the taunting letters. They announce these findings as the key to the lock. Then, the inevitable happens. The evidence is cross-referenced, the logic is tested, and the theory dissolves into the same gray ambiguity. The cycle repeats, cementing the mystery into the bedrock of history. It is no longer just a series of crimes. It is a permanent, unsolvable monument. The researchers return to their desks. The files are shelved, and the phantom of Whitechapel remains undisturbed. The killer has long since outgrown the man who once walked the cobblestones. He has shed the limitations of flesh and bone to become something far more pervasive. He is now a symbol, a dark shorthand for the terror that hides in plain sight. In the modern city, his presence is no longer sought in archives or police reports. He is felt in the sudden, sharp drop in temperature when a street lamp flickers out. He is the weight of a gaze from an empty doorway. He is the instinct that makes a person quicken their pace when the mist rolls off the Thames. Every shadow that stretches across the pavement carries the suggestion of his silhouette. The city has grown around him, replacing gaslight with harsh electric glare, yet the darkness he carved into the district remains untouched by progress. He is the archetype of the unseen threat, a permanent fixture in the urban consciousness. When the wind whistles through the narrow gaps between old brick buildings, it carries the echo of a boot scraping on stone. He is not a ghost of the past, but a living component of the present. He exists wherever there is a corner that light cannot reach, a constant, silent reminder that some secrets are never meant to be unearthed. He is the architecture of fear itself, woven into the very foundations of the streets he once claimed as his own. The mystery of Whitechapel has ceased to be a mere criminal investigation. It has settled into the bedrock of London, maturing into a piece of dark, inescapable folklore. The streets that once echoed with the frantic pace of those fleeing the unknown now carry the weight of a century of whispers. It is a story told in the quiet pauses of conversation, a narrative that refuses to be diluted by the passage of time. The fog that once choked the district has been replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse. Cobblestone legend whispers, a somber city presence, refusing to fade into the background of progress. Every generation inherits the same questions, the same cold curiosity, and the same inability to find an answer. The identity of the man in the mist has been lost, but the void he left behind has been filled by the city itself. It is a permanent scar on the landscape, a reminder that some secrets are not meant to be solved, but rather to be carried forward. The story has become an eternal fixture, as much a part of the city as the river that winds through its heart. The noise of the city eventually dies away, leaving only the stillness of the night. No name remains to be spoken. Fog-shrouded man's truth lost to London's air. Cold mist erases the path. What began in blood ends in absolute, impenetrable silence. The streets are empty. The gaslight flickers and fails, surrendering to the encroaching dark. There is no resolution, only the lingering chill of a secret that has finally achieved the permanence of stone. The man in the fog is gone, leaving nothing but the shadow of his absence. The story closes here, not with an answer, but with the quiet, heavy weight of the unknown.